I've worked in healthcare for over 20 years now, and I have a couple from working in nursing homes of seeing the figure in black shooting across the hall, and then in the next 24 hours a resident will die, and then in less than a week another one will pass as well. But my favorite story is this. I worked at a very small hospital, maybe 30 beds. It has been around for many years. In the basement is of course the old morgue, and there is one elevator that goes from the basement to the main floor outside the nurses' station. This elevator would come up in the middle of the night randomly, and the doors would open and all the staff would get up to go find the patient who just passed away. One night, my coworkers and I were sitting at the nurses' station, and down the short hall to our right, we hear this TV come on, and the volume is up as loud as it can go. One of my CWs and I walk down said hall to find the TV to turn it down. There is one room down that hall that maintenance has the door closed and do not enter signs on the door. After looking in all the open rooms, there is no other room but the closed one to look in. We open the door. There is nothing in this room except the TV. I walked in, turned the TV and said, "Stop that. There's a sick baby next door who needs to sleep, so please be quiet." I walked out and closed the door with no further incidents with the TV. I'm an EMT and eat this stuff up. I'm not necessarily religious, on the fence about it, but I've experienced some stuff I cannot explain. I can recall one fairly well. I was in the basement of the hospital grabbing a new gurney as ours was ripped apart from a violent patient. It was 3 a.m. PQ was on the 3rd floor, and it was locked down for the night. No visitors in the hospital. The basement storage unit was packed with stuff, so when I felt my shirt get pulled on, I assumed it got caught on an object. Then it happened again, only this time, I heard a little girl's voice, crystal clear, say, "I'm lost." My heart was pounding. I felt all the hairs on my body stand up, and I called my partner down to help with the gurney. I've talked to nurses, CNAs, and even some physicians who have had weird experiences, especially in the ICU and hospice side. I used to work on a floor back in the day. Had a patient who was being discharged the next morning, only on PRN pain meds, and hadn't had anything mind-altering all day. I go in his room at 3 a.m. and ask him why he can't sleep. He says, "I'm not hurting or anything, and don't get me wrong, I love kids, but why are y'all letting children run around the unit so late?" I asked what he was talking about. He said, "The kids in the dinosaur and cowboy costumes." I said, "I hadn't seen them, but I'll let the other staff know to send these kids back to their parents," thinking to myself, who the hell let them in here this late in the first place? I head back to the nurses' station and tell the person in charge, who has worked there for years. I tell him, "Hey, the dude in room XY said he can't sleep, because some kids keep coming in his room." He looks at me and says, less alarmed than you'd expect, "Oh, the kids in the dinosaur and cowboy costumes?" I asked a couple other more veteran staff, and they all had stories of patients telling them the same thing. If they were all messing with me, then half the unit and my patient were phenomenal liars. Had something similar happen when I was working in a nursing home. During night shift, we were supposed to set the tables for the next day. So while I walked into a room to set the table there, as I walk past the TV, it turns on its own, which made me jump up. I figured I'd set the table and turn it off. As I'm walking back after I'm done, I mentioned something aloud like, "Thanks, but I'm done, and I'm leaving," after which the TV just turns itself off. Still freaks me out thinking about it. That aside, I've had plenty of instances with weird sounds, doors opening, closing on their own, patients seeing other people, or shadows in their rooms. Like this one time I had a pre-terminal patient laid awake in her bed at night. When I went up to her to ask if she wasn't tired, she mentioned she couldn't go to sleep while having guests and, apparently, she saw all kind of people standing around her bed. I have 3. The first is our unit was moved to the old pediatric floor for a renovation. It was like 3 a.m. and the call bell goes off. This PT is furious because the PT next door has been banging on the walls. We could hear the banging. We apologize, tell them we will go talk to them. Walk into the room next door. The banging stops, and that PT is sound asleep. Second story, had a patient for a couple months. At my old hospital, we had Susie. We never were a unit working with children, but everyone who encountered her claimed her to be about 8 years old. We usually only saw a shadowy figure or heard her running over the unit's floor at night. Sometimes she messed with the lights, call lights, computers, or our old paper charts. She didn't seem malevolent, and a stern, "Not now, Susie, I'm busy," usually kept her in line. She did not like swearing, though. One of our newer doctors once made the mistake to tell her to fuck off. After that, bad luck seemed to follow him whenever he stepped on the unit, misplacing his coffee mug, just to show up later exactly where he had put it down before, but now ice cold. Charts disappearing. Lights turning off in the middle of him placing an IV, which prompted me to call her out and her turning the light back on. His chair going down to the lowest setting every time he sat down, even if we switched chairs. The chair would work perfectly fine for anyone but him. We had him apologies to her and it all stopped, or at least he wasn't that specifically targeted anymore. I kinda miss her. Haven't had any as a nurse, but when I was a night shift CNA in a locked residential behavioral unit, really old building, I had a few. Had a resident who was presumably nonverbal, blank stare. Took care of her for about 2 years and never heard her talk once. She was fairly young, 50s and ambulatory, but only a few led her around. One night, I was stalking the room. It was pretty dark. I had thought that she was sleeping. My back was turned, and from the bed, I heard a really low-toned voice say, "He's here for me." I startled and turned around quick to see her sitting up and looking directly at me, pointing to the opposite corner of the room. I was inwardly freaking out, and I just nodded and haven't had any as a nurse, but when I was a night shift CNA in a locked residential behavioral unit, really old building, I had a few. Had a resident who was presumably nonverbal, blank stare. Took care of her for about 2 years and never heard her talk once. She was fairly young, 50s and ambulatory, but only a few led her around. One night, I was stalking the room, and it was pretty dark. I had thought that she was sleeping. My back was turned, and from the bed, I heard a really low-toned voice say, "He's here for me." I startled and turned around quick to see her sitting up and looking directly at me, pointing to the opposite corner of the room. I was inwardly freaking out, and I just nodded and left. Came back the next night, and she had died. Resident who was there for wandering behaviors due to dementia was a huge favorite among staff since he was so sweet. He called me Mija and had a very distinct voice. Unfortunately, likely had COVID at the very beginning of the pandemic before they had the antigen tests available. Was placed on isolation in the single private room on the unit. Supposedly recovered but developed pneumonia a few weeks later and passed away. I did the post-mortem care. A few days later, administration decided that the locked unit staff were to remain separate from the rest of the building due to COVID and converted the private room into the staff break room. It was a plastic table and a microwave. Anyway, I'm sitting there eating dinner at 2 a.m. when the hair on my arm stands up. I get up from the table and poke my head out into the hall and see no one, and very clearly over my left shoulder, I hear Mija. Gave me chills. Can't say whether it was my head or not, but it freaked me out. Had a resident who self-ambulated to the bathroom at night pretty frequently, with a walker and O2. We would listen and check on him when he was done. Another CNA and I were charting and talking in the hall around midnight when we heard him get up and go into the bathroom. Toilet flush, bedroom light turned on. She stops talking and turns white. The resident had died several days prior, and both of us realized at the same time. No one was in the room, but the light was on, and the bathroom door opened. Bonus points. Frequently saw orbs on the camera feeds in the nurses' station, and another CNA claimed that one time, all of the unit TVs switched onto the Hallmark channel really loudly, and at the same time in the middle of the night. I don't know. That was a weird place. Thank you for watching. If you want more ghost stories like this, make sure to click on the video below.